Welcome to Educational Psychology 301. That's the number of the class. Just a brief description of what the class is. This is taken straight from the course syllabus. It says the course applies psychology to education. The topic of learning is studied through the investigation of the learner's development mentally, physically, spiritually, and socially. Theories of learning are compared and contrasted with a Christian philosophy of education. So really this class could be either for counted as a psychology class or education, depending on your major. Since you're an education major, or it's going to count for as education, obviously. So, I'm sure you've taken a lot of education classes so far, and you're ready to graduate, ready to get out.
Yep.
And hopefully we'll try to make this, I know a lot of the material, some people will think it to be dull and maybe boring, but we'll try to liven it up a little bit, make it a little more exciting, and hopefully keep you awake.
Okay.
So, we're going to talk a little bit about psychology and education. And I don't know if you've read this book before, but it's called Think Biblically by John MacArthur.
I've heard of it. I haven't.
It's a really good book. I recommend you read the whole thing, but just for this class, there's one specific chapter in here that I want you to read.
Okay.
And the name of the chapter is, and we could make copies of this for you, the name of the chapter is Why Christian Education and Not Secular Indoctrination. And to me, this was a really good chapter. And I really think it would help you for this class, just to get a grasp on Christian education, the philosophy of that. I'm sure by now you got a good handle on that so far, but I think this chapter will help you with that,
Okay.
especially with our approach to educational psychology. As far as the textbook is concerned, I'm not really sure if you want to buy it or make copies of it,
Okay.
or however you want to do it. The name of the book is Psychology Applied to Teaching.
Okay.
This is the third edition, and the copyright's 2003. I'm sure since then they've come up with newer additions to it. But this is the book I'll be going through as I teach you. If you would like, up until you get a book, you can make copies of all the pages, the chapters.
Okay.
What we're going to try to do every class, every time we meet, is I'm just going to try to go through 2 chapters
Okay.
every class, and hopefully. I believe we're going to be meeting about 13 times. I kind of added it up. So I think after 13 classes, we should be able to make it through the book.
Okay.
Now, we're not going to cover every single thing in the book. What I'm going to do as I teach you is I'm going to pull out some of the key things and just present it in class.
Okay.
And on your own time, since I know you got a lot of time on your hands, just kind of, whenever you have a chance, just read through the chapters as we go along.
Okay.
And so, just, keep in mind we're going to be, every class, 2 chapters. So, if you want, just be prepared for when you come in here.
Okay.
Just so you have an idea as to what we're talking about. You can help me, you can teach me if you want. So, the idea of the class is just go through the book, and before the end of the semester, it'll be, we've already talked about this chapter in Thinking Biblically. Just try to have that read, and if you would, just try to have just a short critique on that.
Okay.
Just follow the guidelines of the GBC manual.
1 page in length.
Just 1 page.
Okay.
And I believe we're going to have just 1 midterm and then 1 final.
Okay.
And it's nothing to worry about. Don't get worried about that. I'll try to make it reasonable.
Okay.
Since you brought me 2 apples. We'll have the midterm and the final. And then also, since I'm loading you up, I'm required to give you a term paper.
Okay.
A 10-page term paper, double space, the Turabian style. And really, the topic is going to be up to you as far as anything. It can be anything regarding anything we cover in class, anything in the book, anything at all. I'm going to leave that up to you as far as educational psychology is concerned.
Okay.
So, what is educational psychology? Do you have any idea what educational psychology is? Do you have any thoughts? The term is scary because a lot of big words. Psychology is a word itself that will kind of throw a lot of people off, or raise a lot of eyebrows, especially in a Christian environment. But the thing we want to keep in mind is, sure, psychology has really been watered down as far as humanistic ideas. It's really rooted and founded in humanistic theories, humanistic thinking. A lot of secular ideas come from psychology, but there are certain principles and aspects that we can pull out in order to get a better understanding, especially with regards to education. And that's one of the things we're trying to just to convey and get across in this class is what is it that we do pull out from that. And the idea is you pull out the meat and you throw away the bones. But as far as, a lot of times when you think of psychology and when psychology is thrown around, you automatically think about therapy and counseling and things like that. And that is obviously, there's psychotherapy and things of that nature. The thing is when it comes to counseling and therapy, we at Georgia Baptist College, in a church and in a Baptist environment, we do what's called biblical counseling, which you're very familiar with. And that is an approach to where we just take the Word of God, and it's just the Word of God by itself. It's called biblical counseling for that reason. That's solely the Word of God, because we believe that if Christ is sufficient, we also believe that the Bible is sufficient. And it can stand alone as far as meeting problems, counseling problems, having solutions for the counselee, the person who comes for help. And a lot of times there's also, we have a biblical counseling approach here, but elsewhere you may find what's called Christian counseling. And Christian counseling, what they do a lot of times is they take psychotherapy, some terms from psychotherapy and psychology, and they try to blend that together with the Bible and create one thing. But we don't really agree with that, because what happens when you add two things like that together is biblical counseling, the aspect of the Bible and biblical principles, what happens is that gets so watered down that there's no effect there. And it's like trying to combine two things that absolutely can't go together. And why can't they go together? Because they don't even agree. You got one side, this is psychology that's so secular, that's so humanistic, it's completely opposite of the biblical perspective. Now, humanism it's a term you can't get around, you can't get away from, especially when you do any kind of study on psychology at all. Humanism always seems like it comes up. And for that reason, it's so rooted in the whole thing of psychology. You got Sigmund Freud, you've got Carl Rogers, you've got all these guys who focus on the self. And that's basically what humanism is. It's all about the individual having the resources within themselves to solve their own problems. And that's with regards to counseling or therapy or anything like that. When an individual comes for biblical counseling, they have their own problems in a biblical counseling environment. They come to the counselor, they express their problems that they have, and what the counselor will do is go directly to the Word of God and get their eyes off of themselves and get their eyes on Christ. So that's the whole approach to biblical counseling rather than humanistic. But when it comes to educational psychology, there are certain principles that we can pull from psychology. And as we go along, what we'll try to do is show you some of these things that we can pull from psychology and from studying this and apply it to education. Now, what I'm going to try to do, I'm not an education major. I've got very little education experience with regards to education, but what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to focus on the psychology point, but I'm also going to pull some aspects from education and just to combine those two together and show you how psychology can be joined with education. So the first question I have is, since you're an education major, you have a desire to teach, and that's good. But my question is, why do you want to teach?
To change and mold lives.
Sure.
Make a difference.
Right. And as a teacher, you've got to have that desire, you've got to have that drive and that goal. But what we're gonna talk about today, this is just an introduction before we really just dive into the material today, is the question of why do we teach? As teachers, you have to have that goal. You have to have the passion, the desire to change lives, as you said. And really, if you look at the goal of counseling, even that is the goal that we often strive for, and that's to bring about change. And if you've read Jim Berg's book on Change into His Image, that's the point he really tries to drive home, is that change is the goal of counseling. But he also brought about the fact that it's not just any change that we're trying to get across, it's biblical change. And as a teacher, you specifically have a great advantage, because you have, especially with young children, you have the opportunity to be used by God in order to shape their lives, in order to set the stage for the things that they'll learn. You can either make the difference by allowing them to learn Christian and biblical principles, or you can set the stage as So many of the public high schools that are controlled by the government, what they do is indoctrinate them on the secular issues of humanism. So, but the question, why teach? Well, let's back up from that question and ask another one. Why do we do anything that we do? And we know that we do everything that we do is for what? The glory of God. Why do we do anything we do? Why do we teach? Well, we teach for the glory of God. And then you ask the other question, how can we glorify God by teaching? In every aspect of everything you'll teach, whether it be English, whether it be math, whether it be science, any of these different subjects that the children will want to learn in school, you have the responsibility as a teacher to glorify God by teaching these classes. And how do you do that? You do that by always trying to get the children to see God. Everything that's done, whether it be math, science. Now, science is an easy one. You can teach the children the bigness of the world. Show them the geography of the world, the earth, the outer space, all of these things. And in that, they see the bigness of God because they see the Creator. They see creation. They see that, and they see an aspect of God. You as a teacher have the ability to show them, as God's instrument, you have the ability to show the students the many different aspects and the many different attributes of God Himself in creation. In math, you do the multiplication. You teach them division. You teach them all these numbers in an attempt to possibly show them in order that they may get a grasp on infinity. Because if they get a grasp on infinity, they understand that God is infinite. And they understand the bigness of God. And so in a way, that's what being a teacher is all about. To be an instrument and to be a tool used by God to get glory to God by teaching the children about God. And that's the way it's always been. All throughout the Old Testament, the parents were specifically the ones instructed to teach the children. It was never, if you look all throughout history of the Bible, all throughout the Bible, it was never supposed to be, an education was never supposed to be run by the government. This is something that we've come up with, modernly, as government over all the schools, in charge of the schools. But if you go according to biblical principles, it was never supposed to be that way. It was always supposed to be the parents, and specifically the fathers were the ones that would be the instructors and the teachers of the children. So that's the question, is why teach? We teach for the glory of God. A lot of times specifically in secular schools and public schools, what will happen is basically the children are being indoctrinated in humanistic methods, being able to see the world through humanistic eyes. And what they do is, if you'll pretend that this circle represents humanism, and humanistic mindset, humanistic thinking. Humanism. What happens in public schools commonly is also this circle will represent the different aspects of things that they'll learn, like math, sciences. And you've got every aspect of life. And all of this boils over, and it affects their own personal, it affects how they live, it affects their family life. It affects how will the children grow up and to become parents. It affects how they raise their own children through a humanistic mindset. Family, science, family, math, English, everything. All of the different subjects that they learn in school. But what we as Christian teachers want to try to do is to be used by God to allow the children to acquire a biblical mindset. And it's the same idea, is to look at every aspect of things that can be taught in school, whether it be science, math, English, everything, social studies, geography, all the different subjects in school, is to look at through a biblical worldview. To acquire that biblical worldview is the goal of the teacher. And when doing that, that brings God glory. So you ask, how can you as a teacher, how can you as a teacher bring God glory? By allowing the children to obtain the biblical mindset, because that ultimately brings God glory. So this is your competition as a teacher. This is what you're competing against. This is what you are striving for, the biblical mindset rather than the humanistic, self-centered mindset. So, it's important to realize as a teacher the nature of the students, the nature of who it is that you're trying to teach. These are your targets, in other words. The ones you're targeting with a biblical mindset are the students. You have to understand where they come from, you have to understand what they're made of, and you have to understand their mindset that they already have coming into this teaching environment. And that is one in which they already are leaning towards a humanistic mindset anyways to begin with. They are already sinful, as the Bible indicates, specifically in Romans chapter 3. In chapter 1 of Romans, Paul deals extensively with the sinfulness of the Gentiles. Romans 2, the sinfulness of the Jews. And then in Romans 3, I guess he figures that if anybody else is left out there, he's going to hammer them too. So he deals with the sinfulness of the entire world, everybody, Jew, Gentile, everybody. Nobody is excluded. And so the cute little children that you're trying to teach in your classes, little Johnny and little Susie, are already, even though as cute as they may be, they come into your class already professional heathens. And that's hard to imagine. And a lot of people out there may not agree with that. But that's just the way it is, according to Romans, according to the Bible. It goes against the humanistic mindset, but that's what you need to face as a teacher. You need to go in there already with it in mind, that the kids that you're trying to teach are already humanistic, they're already sinful, and they're already, unless God has done a work of salvation at an early age, they're lost already. And they're already bent towards sin, they're already depraved, and they're already humanistic. So you think, how does educational psychology come into this? Well, to understand how it comes in, we need a definition. We need a good definition of what is educational psychology. And for this, to give you the best definition I can, I'm just going to read it straight from the book and you can write it down. It says, this description of educational psychology suggests, and this is pretty long, so get ready to write. Description of educational psychology suggests that to become the most effective teacher possible, you will need to understand such aspects. You will need to understand such aspects of the learner, as physical, social, emotional, cognitive development, cultural, and intellectual differences. And this definition is straight from the book, so if you get your book, you can read all about the definition. It goes into more detail. But that's a good description of what educational psychology is all about. It's taking into consideration that every student that comes into your classroom that sits on all the desks, each one of them has been shapen, and they're specifically been shapen by all of these different aspects of their life. And in other words, they come in here, no student is alike. No student will learn the exact same way. And as a teacher, you have to keep that in mind, that each student is different, and you have to have a different learning approach when you try to teach each one of these students. It's like when it snows. Each one of the snowflakes that falls down has specifically a different design. There's no snowflake that's alike. Each student is not alike. Now the overview of them is alike, in which they're bent towards sin, they're sinful. But as far as their background, all of these things that we listed, such as their cognitive development, their cultural, social, all of these things that we've listed, plays a part in shaping how they learn. And as a teacher, you need to understand that each one of them learns a different way. Why? Because of their history, because of everything that makes up who they are. Because no student is alike. Now, imagine if a student comes into your class and his mother and father have recently had a divorce. Well, that even though, his parents have had a divorce, that will somehow play an impact on how he learns and how he functions in class. Whereas you've got Jimmy over here, whose parents, they've been married for 20 years and he has a nice home environment. He will learn different than the other kid. Their background will cause them to learn differently. And that's just the way that God has designed this thing. It's complex. So educational psychology focuses on how the children learn, but it also focuses on how the teacher teaches. The methods that the teacher uses in instructing his children. Now, in the Bible, there are what are referred to as gifts of the Spirit. And one of the gifts of the Spirit happened to be teaching. And in anything we do, if it's a gift from God, it's not Jolene who does the gift. It's not Matthew. It's not the pastors of the church who do it. It's God, the Holy Spirit, working through that person. The individual is a tool used by God. And that's the thing to keep in mind, is when an individual is going to a counselor, that counselor, if he's filled with the Spirit, he's controlled by God himself through the Spirit. He's an instrument that God uses in order to bring about the change in the individual. When a preacher stands up to preach, if he's truly anointed by God as a preacher, he'll be filled with the Spirit, and God will use him as an instrument. And the same applies to teachers in the classroom. They are the instrument that God uses, and it's necessary to be effectively used by God correctly in the way God wants you to be used. And in order to, as we drew the things on the board, in order to bring about the change, in order to give them that biblical mindset that we are desiring as teacher to do, we cannot do that of ourselves. There is a requirement that God fills us with the Spirit. So in order to be the most effective teacher you can be, the requirement is to be a Spirit-filled teacher. And in being a Spirit-filled teacher, this will ultimately also bring God glory, which is the number one goal of teaching, period, is to bring God glory. So why do we teach? To glorify God. Why do we teach? To bring about change in the children, a desired change of giving them that biblical mindset, which is another way of saying to glorify God, because that is a way of glorifying God. Now, a lot of times what psychology will try to do with these secular methods will rob the individual of being made in the image of God. Now, specifically what's referred to as behavioral methods of psychology, behavioral counseling. What we'll try to do is try to abase man down to the image of an animal. Because you can teach animals tricks, you can teach animals how to sit, how to beg, how to roll over. There are also methods from the behavioral science, the behavioral therapy, behavioral approach to psychology that we can actually pull certain principles from and apply them to specifically, in our case, the students. But in doing so, we're keeping in mind that man is made in the image of God. And it's interesting that in the fall, in the Garden of Eden, we can see all these different approaches of psychology at work. We can see Satan, who's a serpent. He deceives Eve, and she takes of the fruit, she gives to her husband. When God comes on the scene and he's questioning each of the individuals involved in the incident, he's questioning. You can see the different methods of psychology at work here. You can see what's known as the Freudian approach, which is originated by a man named Sigmund Freud, which I'm sure you're familiar with. In his method of therapy, he would always try to get the individual to go back to the past and to trace back, usually to their early childhood, specific instances where someone did them wrong, someone abused them, whatever the case may be. He would always try to shift the blame off of the person who's come for counseling and try to find someone in their past to put the blame on. Usually it's their parents. And so what happens in the garden? Well, Eve is the first one confronted by God, specifically regarding, or actually Adam is the first one confronted by God, because God went directly to Adam, because Adam's in charge. He's over Eve. He's the authority figure there. So God goes directly to Adam, and what happens? We see the Freudian approach here. What did Adam do? He said, the wife that you gave me, she's the one that did it. So Adam did what's referred to as blame shifting. He took the blame off of himself and said, Eve's the one that did it. I didn't do it, she did it. So God goes then to Eve, and he says, asked her the exact same question, regarding the situation. And what did Eve do? She did the same thing Adam did. She shifted the blame. And then you also see the humanistic approach as well, because the entire time the serpent comes on the scene. The serpent's there. He's behind the whole thing as well. And we also see the behavioral methods at work also, because what happens? Satan is attempting to debase man to the level of an animal. And it is also in the same portion of Scripture, Genesis, at the creation, in which we find out that man is not an animal. Man is above the animals because why? He's made in the image of God. But as we said, there are certain methods that we can pull out from the behavioral study of why we do things that we do and how we come about learning. And that's there's a phrase for it, it's called conditioning. And there are certain aspects that we can pull from that with regards to behavior and learning. And the phrase for it is called, we already referred to it as conditioning, but another phrase for it, which is more commonly known, is called behavior modification. Behavior modification. And the man that really came up with this, his name was B.F. Skinner. He really came up with this approach, and what the approach really involved was he did a study that involved birds, pigeons specifically. And they were in the cage, and what would happen is there was a little button towards the bottom of the cage, and the pigeons would be in there, and eventually they would peck around the cage, and eventually if they hit the button, a little thing of food would fall in there and they would eat it. So after a while, they peck the button again for the second time. What happens is food falls in again. So every time they press the button, food drops in for them. So eventually their brains start to pick up on the idea that, hey, every time I push this button, I'm going to get food. And every time they do, it happens, they get food. So the food that they get in this situation is what's referred to as the reward. This is how we pull apart the reward system for children. We can pull that from this, and basically we can apply it to a teaching situation. And you'll find times where this is very appropriate. When children do good, in order to get them to do it again, the same desired behavior is to give them the reward. If the whole class gets an A on a test, or A or B on the test, reward them by, give them a pizza party or something. There are different methods of you can be as creative as you want to be as far as the reward. But this is it works. Not only does it work, but it's also biblical. And in fact, to show you that it is biblical, Proverbs chapter 3. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. If you read that, what you're going to find, and I'm going to read that in just a second, but what we're going to find when we read over that is there are about 6 different instructions that God gives. And also with those instructions that God gives, there's a reward. Basically, if you do this, this will happen. And that's the whole idea that we want to pull from behavior modification, is that if the students do the desired that we want, do the things that we want them to do as far as learning or things, good behavior, the desired behavior, if the students do that, they will get the reward. And that's a biblical principle that we can pull directly from Proverbs. And verse 1 through 10. Verse 1 says, "My son, forget not my law." Here's the command. "Let thine heart keep my commandments." And verse 2 shows the reward. "For length of days and long life and peace shall they add to thee." Verse 3 picks up with another command. "Let not mercy and truth forsake thee. Bind them about thy neck, and write them upon the table of thine heart." And verse 4 shows the reward. "So shalt thou find favor and good understanding in the sight of God and man." Verse 5, "Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not to thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him." And what? Here's the reward. "He shall direct thy paths." Verse 7, "Be not wise in thine own eyes. Fear the Lord, and depart from evil. And it shall be health to thy navel, and marrow to thy bones." And here's the last one. It says, "Honor the Lord with thy substance, and with the first fruits of all thine increase." And the reward is this: "So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine." So obviously, after reading that, we can see that there is room for this mindset of pulling apart and pulling out from the behavior modification this reward system. Now there's another man who was involved with the study of behaviorism, and his name was Ivan Pavlov. Maybe you've heard of him. Ivan Pavlov. He had the same kind of goal, and that was to bring about a response from, in his case, since he's behavior, he studied a lot of behaviorism. He did use animals. He used dogs, and that's the idea we want to kind of shy away from, is to keep in mind always that man is made in the image of God. Even though all these behavioral scientists, they're really big on studying animals, and they did study humans. Ivan Pavlov, when he originally started out, I believe he was a physicist. I mean, he wasn't involved in psychology at all. And as far as I know, he didn't have an interest in getting into that. But being a physicist, he studied animals, dogs. Specifically, he was studying how much dogs would salivate when they were given food. And in one of his experiments, he came across a discovery that he didn't intend to do. And in his study, what he would do is he would ring a bell and then give the dog food. And then when the bell started, it would start he had a device in the dog's mouth somehow that would measure out how much of the salivation was there. And so when the bell would ring, the dog was given food. And immediately when the bell rang, after a while, the dog didn't think anything of the bell until the food came on the scene. So after a while, they went through this process. What Pavlov found out was, wait a minute, the bell rings and then the dog starts salivating before the food even comes on the scene. And so what he found out was he could through behavior modification, he could cause the dog to respond to something that he normally wouldn't have responded to in the way that he would have. And there are 4 different aspects to this. I'll just abbreviate them, but I'll tell you what they mean. It's conditioned response and an unconditioned response. And then there's just unconditioned. And then there's conditioned behavior, unconditioned behavior. Now, the unconditioned response, unconditioned behavior, what these 2 aspects are is the unconditioned behavior was giving the dog the food. So unconditioned behavior is food in this situation. The response, the unconditioned response here, was the dog would salivate. The dog didn't have to be taught to salivate. That's just something physically that he would do as a response of the unconditioned behavior, which was giving him the food. The conditioned behavior, in this situation that we're talking about, was the bell. And the goal that we're trying to get across in this study is to get the conditioned response to be the same as the unconditioned response, and in this case, the salivation. So what Pavlov was, what he accomplished in his, unintentionally what he accomplished was, he got the dog to salivate just from the bell, from the sound of the bell. Salivation. Salivate. So you've got the conditioned response, conditioned behavior. Unconditioned response, unconditioned behavior. And this is the same thing we can pull out. This is the whole idea of behaviorism, is conditioning the students and getting them to that place where they will give you the desired response and in class. And you're going to have kids that'll be jumping all over the place, that'll be loud and noisy and disruptive, and the desired response that you want to get across is, sit down, be quiet, and to learn. And as a teacher, you need to understand, ways of getting them to get to that desired response. Now, what do you think would happen if the dog was given the, after you got the dog to the place where he is conditioned to salivate every time he hears that bell? What do you think would happen if you started ringing the bell and nothing would, no food was given to him?
Eventually, the conditioned response is not going to be
Right.
to salivate.
After a while, now at first he would still salivate, but eventually it would start to taper off. And that tapering off period is what's referred to as extinction. Eventually he would stop salivating. Now, after he was extinct, after that response would have been extinct, and you were to, forget the bells for a long time, and then if you, ring the bell again after a long period of time where he hasn't even heard it, he would probably pick back up on it right away at first, but eventually it would taper right back off again. So that's just the way that we learn. That's the way animals learn in that situation, and humans are the same way. In fact, this is the process in which we train our pets. I mean, I have a dog at home where when I was going through psychology classes, I picked up on some of this years ago, and in a way I've kind of trained my dog to do specific things, and it works, because when I need to let him out to go outside, I'll ask him, do you want to go? And I've done that every time, and so he knows to jump up and run to the door. He knows it's time to go when I ask him that. Now, does he comprehend, does he understand English? No, he just has heard that so many times that he's conditioned to go every time that he's heard that he hears that. Now, what do you think would happen if I kept asking him that same question over and over again, but I didn't go let him out? Eventually, he would go through the extinction process, and it wouldn't mean anything to him. So, that's how we train our dogs. You train your dog to sit. When he sits, you give him a reward for it, a treat or something. After he finally figures out, wait a minute, every time I sit, I'm going to get a reward. Then you've got him trained. Of course, then you got the problem whenever he sits and you don't have a treat around. Then you got to figure out something to do. So this is behaviorism. And I just wanted to give an overview of how we're going to pull certain things out and then apply it to the classroom. Now, there is a chapter in this book where we're going to deal more in depth with behaviorism. I just want to give kind of an overview of what it is, just so when the time comes, you'll be able to understand some of these concepts and ideas. Now, there's another phrase here as far as behaviorism goes. I kind of forgot this one. There was an experiment that they did on a little baby. The little baby's name was Albert. They referred to him as Little Albert. He's famous. He's in just about every psychology textbook you'll find. Little Albert, what they did was they set the little baby down and they put in his lap a little white rabbit. And as soon as they put the rabbit in his lap, one of the scientists would come up behind him and they'd ring a really loud bell right behind him, make a really loud noise. The kid would start, the baby would start crying, and then they'd take the rabbit away, and then the baby would be okay. So eventually they got to the place they would do this constantly until they got to the place where they would bring the white rabbit, sit the rabbit down in front of them. And they wouldn't even have to ring the loud noise and make the bell ring, because the baby would start crying automatically just from seeing the rabbit. Why do you think that is?
It was associating the rabbit with the sound.
Sure. He had been conditioned There's our word again. He's been conditioned to respond to the rabbit in the way that he normally would have to the noise behind him. Why? Because every time those two join together all the time, the rabbit and the noise behind him. So he sees the rabbit and he gets scared and he cries. Now there's a term here which they did. They took the experiment to a different level. They took it and they brought something that was white, but it wasn't a rabbit, but it was white, you know, like a white handkerchief. Anything white. They started bringing things that was white, set it down in front of them, and the baby would start crying. Why? Because it was white and kind of resembled the rabbit, but it wasn't the rabbit. This is a phrase called generalization. The child would equate anything that resembled the rabbit, and so he would respond the same way that he normally would to the rabbit. Generalization. So, and this is the way when you're in counseling, you may come across people who have what's referred to as phobias. This is how those phobias have developed over the past. All the textbooks explain it all the same way, and it's all done through behavior modification. You know, the kid almost drowns when he was a child. He fell out of a boat, so he developed that unconditioned response, and the conditioned response, and all that goes together, and it ties together. And so what happens? The kid gets afraid of boats, so he develops this phobia. He doesn't want anything to do with boats. He doesn't go near the water, and that's from that we can see how behavior modification plays into even counseling, how that works that way. Going back, we made a comment earlier about, as a teacher, it's one of the necessities is to be a spirit-filled teacher in class. Now, it's one thing to have, and Paul dealt with this specifically in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians. He dealt with this extensively. How it's one thing to have a spiritual gift, but what is it that you need in order for it to operate the way that it's meant to? And that's in 1 Corinthians 13. He deals with love. You've got to have the love that in order for it to operate right. And that's the requirement as for the teacher as well. When you're in a classroom, you're having a bad day, and you really don't feel like dealing with 24 loud, obnoxious children, one thing is going to keep you going, and that is the love that you have in your heart for those children. As a spirit-filled teacher, you're going to have that love for the children, and that's going to allow you, God's going to use that. He's going to kindle that fire, and you're going to be able to tolerate the loud kids throwing the paper across the room. It's the love that you have for the students, and the love you have ultimately for God Himself, that's going to bring you back day after day. You're going to be up late hours at night preparing your lessons for the next day in order to teach the children. And that's what it takes, because going back to what we said earlier, it takes the love in order to deal with depraved men anyway, specifically the children in your case. To deal and to recognize that they are bent towards sin, they're depraved, and yet you come in here with a love in your heart for these children anyway. And so that is a requirement in order to be effectively used as a spirit-filled teacher. And that's what Paul dealt with. Now, education. What do you think would be the purpose and the goal of education? Obviously, we've already covered things like to glorify God and things like that. But as far as from a human viewpoint, one of the purposes of education is to advance humanity one step further, advance the next generation one step forward. Because, imagine this is the timeline. And let's say you got certain inventions, like the car was invented in this year. And in this year, you've got, many, many, many years later, you've got, certain things like DVD players coming out, cell phones. And imagine if you were in, and do you think that the car came out in this year, do you think that the DVD player could have come out, and the cell phones and the modern inventions that we have today, the video cameras, do you think it could have come out in this year? Why?
Because it needed to, the basic mechanisms of a car needed to be established before you get into the more difficult
Sure.
aspects of a DVD or so forth.
Sure. As far as educationally, as far as intelligence was concerned, we had not advanced that far enough yet. What had to happen was years had to go by in which, now the cars that were invented in the early years look nothing like the cars we have today. Why? Because our technology has advanced. Our minds have, as far as our learning and things. What we learn today, we pass down to our children, and our children pass that down to their children, and we advance in progress towards, we like to think of it as improvement. So that's one of the goals, you could say, from a human standpoint, as far as us advancing educationally over the next generation, and their generation does the exact same thing. Basically, knowledge and discoveries are passed on from previous generations through education. Education is the tool that's used in order to pass down our knowledge and our discoveries. Now, throughout the past, humanism, as we've already mentioned, humanism invaded education. Now, it hadn't always really been this way. Of course, there's two sides to that. Really, it's really flared up over the last 50 years as far as humanism, 100 years or so. It's really flared up. But if you really look at it, it's always been this way ever since. This is what we've always, as teachers, this is what we have always battled, is humanism, ever since the fall. Humanism invaded education. The study of science shifted from the discovery of God's creation. Now, we use science to help us to understand and to see more of God's creation. That's the goal of science, because that ultimately brings glory to God, as we've already mentioned. As humanism invaded education, the study of science shifted away from the discovery of God's creation to developing many different scientific theories that do nothing but exclude God from the world, and from creation, from science, and from they look at the Bible as not scientific, but really the Bible will do nothing but back up true science. And you've heard the phrase before, eventually true science catches up with the Bible. And that's just the way it is. The Bible, from a scientific viewpoint, the Bible is 100% accurate as far as science is concerned. But that's a phrase, you'll find that phrase actually in Thinking Biblically by John MacArthur. As humanism invaded education, the study of science shifted from discovery of God's creation to developing scientific theories that exclude God. The invention of what's referred to as rationalism. That's another big word. Rationalism. Rationalism is basically, if you boil it down, all it is trying to come up with what's thought of as a logical way to explain how the world was created. And different aspects of creation, our sciences, many different aspects, is basically rational. It's trying to come up with logical, and that's the key word, logic. That's all it is coming up with logical ways to explain things. Now, the Bible explains a lot of stuff for us, and we understand that is true. People who don't believe the Bible don't see it as true, so they have to come up with their own methods of how the world was created. And it comes directly from rationalism. Rationalism was basically the parent. This was the father or the mother of evolution, rationalism. Evolution came directly from rationalism. Evolution is one of the enemies as a teacher with a biblical mindset and as a biblical perspective. Evolution is one of the enemies that you'll face in the classroom. So, now, what we want to do is go over I'm going to list 3 of the responsibility of education. These are 3 responsibilities of education. The first responsibility is that every individual is accountable to God to be a learner. Every individual is accountable to God to be a learner. individual who's saved, who's a believer, they have in them, they have a passion that they can't get away from. They have a passion for godly wisdom. Now think about this. You can't be wise. You can't become wise without being a learner at some point. You can't become wise unless you're a learner. Proverbs chapter 2, verses 1 through 4 explains this perfectly. And it reads this. It says, "My son, if thou wilt receive my words and hide my commandments with thee, so that thou incline thine ear unto wisdom and apply thine heart to understanding." And that's the key phrase, to apply your heart. That means everything that you are. I mean, 100% sincerity, everything, you go at it 100%. "Yea, if thou criest after knowledge, and liftest up thy voice for understanding, if thou seekest her as silver, and searchest for her as for hid treasures." Verse 5 says, "Then shalt thou understand the fear of the Lord, and find the knowledge of God." So in other words, every one of us is accountable to God Himself for being a learner. I mean, God requires of us to be a learner, obviously. Number 2, the second responsibility of education. And we've touched on this. And that's parents are responsible for educating their children. Parents are responsible for the education of their children. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 4 through 9. It's referred to as the Shema. Actually, it's Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9. I'm sorry. Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9 says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart. And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. Thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes. And thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house and on thy gates." So basically, what we learn there is that it is the parents' responsibility to teach their children. We don't see this very often. We find families who think that it's either the church's job to educate the children. They think it's maybe the public school's job to educate their children. A lot of parents will shy away from that, but it's a good thing. Parents are the ones designed by God to be the ultimate teachers of their children. Now, that's not to negate anything about Christian education in a classroom setting, because I think that's needful as well. But ultimately, by God, the parents are the ones that need to be doing the bulk of the educating of their children. So, number 3, the third responsibility for education. And we touched on this one as well. And it's, education is not explicitly mandated. Education is not explicitly mandated from the government. It is not an explicitly mandated function of the government. Meaning this, you can look through the Bible from Genesis all the way to Revelation, cover to cover, and you can't find anywhere in the Bible where it indicates anything at all about the government being the ones responsible for educating children. Now, we find modernly that it is the government, that it's got the public school system that's going, and all it is, as we mentioned earlier, is an indoctrination of humanism. But biblically, according to biblical standards, nowhere does it say that the government is the function that is to educate the children. So those are the 3 responsibilities of education. Now, James chapter 3 and verse 1 is a verse that as a teacher, every teacher needs to read James 3:1. Because it is really an eye-opener for teachers. James chapter 3 and verse 1. It says, "My brethren, be not many masters, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation." Now, if you interpreted this in the old Greek, in the English, As far as the Old English is concerned, it says, not many masters. Masters is another word for teachers. So if we reinterpret it, it says, my brethren, be not many teachers, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation. Basically what he's saying is that the words of the teachers will be weighed by God with a lot of weight. God will weigh everything as a teacher that you say, that you communicate to the students. The teacher's speech will be judged very harshly. Because you could be, as a teacher, you could be a giver of life, an instrument that God uses as a giver of life. Or as a teacher, you could be one that would take life from the child, from the student. So, James is giving a warning in his epistle because evidently the church that he was writing to, the believers that he was writing to, what he found happening was a lot of the believers were rising up to the scene, saying they have the gifts of teaching. They're teachers. I'm a teacher. I'm a teacher. So James is warning them, saying, look, you need to be careful. If you're called to teach, this is something serious. God's going to judge every word you say when it comes to teaching. So, the same applies to us today. Teachers are judged by God. God is specifically concerned with everything that teachers say, teachers teach in class. So, educational psychology, as we've learned, it's keeping in mind that each one of the students have a different background, and everything in their background makes up their learning experience, how they learn, how they function in class. And as a teacher, there are different methods that you're going to have to use for each student, because one method will work for this student, but it won't work for Sally. One method will work for Johnny, but it won't work for Billy on the front. A lot of teachers like to put certain kids, they have assigned seatings in class. And that's a good idea, because there are certain children that will not function to the best of their ability that sit in the back. And a lot of times they won't pay attention, they'll look out the window, so you want to have those kids sit up front. I mean, there's certain methods as teaching that you have to incorporate into your style of teaching. And basically, if you read the textbook, chapter 1, it goes through giving a good definition of what educational psychology is, giving you specific details. All we want for this class is just to go through an overview of it. And I think so far we've given you the basic idea of it. On your own reading, just kind of read through and pull out your own ideas, and just to get, just to have a better understanding of what it is. But all I'm interested in is getting across to you the main thought that each child, each student that you'll teach is different according to God. God designed us that way. So as a teacher, you just need to be aware of that. Now, do you have in mind, if you don't mind me asking, do you have a specific age group that you're interested, you feel God's leading you to teach?
It's specifically probably 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds.
Right.
As far as the educational side of it, involvement in the church, I love teaching the teen girls.
Mm-hmm.
So it varies depending on which situation I'm in.
Sure, it does. And that's good, because we're going to show you some different, before today's over with, hopefully we'll get into, and you'll see your age group that you have a preference for, hopefully. We're going to get into what's referred to as psychosocial, cognitive development, and then social development. And there's different age, we're going to go through the different ages and show you how they develop as they grow throughout the lifespan. So you're going to see your age group in there, and so you'll have a better understanding of how to teach them, how to be used by God in that. And I'm just going to give you a warning. There are certain things that we're going to go over in class that we, as Christians, we won't agree with. What we're going to do is just pull out, like we said, pull out the meat and throw away the bones.
Yeah.
Teaching, the book goes into a little detail as describing teaching as two different things. It says teaching is an art, and then it says teaching is a science. As far as the art is concerned, it says teaching as an art involves beliefs, emotions, values, and flexibility. These would be people who would be considered to be gifted teachers. If you can remember your own, a lot of times if you didn't homeschool and you had different teachers growing up in high school or even middle school, you can think of all the different personalities that that you had as teachers. And you had some teachers that were just really dull. They just stood up and just read directly from their books. than other teachers. I remember when I was in college, I had a teacher that actually stood up on his desk. I mean, there was one instance where he stood up on his desk. And so that's the idea, teaching as an art. Is sometimes as a teacher, you're going to have to do things that, in order to get the students' attentions, as if it is an art, as an artist, however you want to word it. As a teacher, if you believe teaching as an art, that's what's involved, is doing all these creative things, as we mentioned, beliefs, emotions, values, all these things to keep the students in tune with what you're teaching. There's also, and there's a lot of people that don't, even in this book, that don't agree with this, teaching as a science. And that's using a lot of the different scientific methods and statistics and things like that in order to help to grow your class in the right direction. Using scientific methods, science as a teaching as a science is using a lot of different scientific methods and calculations and numbers and things. So teaching as an art, teaching as a science, but we believe teaching is a gift from God, as the teacher is filled with the Spirit and used by God. Now there are aspects of teaching as an art. I mean, there are lost people out there who, if you see them teach, they have that gift. It seems that they have a gift to stand up and to teach well, to keep the students' attention and really be successful as far as teaching goes. And that would be teaching as an art. But what really happens, what we want is to have teaching as an art and to be filled with the Spirit and to join those together. And with that, you've got the well-rounded teacher. But here's the thing you also have to keep in mind, is that God can use anybody. I mean, a lot of the preachers you'll find are really shy, really quiet, reserved, and yet they stand up and with the power of God they deliver powerful messages. And there's great moves of God that come on the people. God moves among the people. Why? Because this shy individual stood up, and through the power of God, God was able to transform him and to use him to deliver a message. So don't think just because you're shy and quiet and you may not be very well with children, you be used by God as a teacher. It usually helps if you like children, but God can use anybody. But it just seems like it works so well if you have the teaching as an art and the Holy Spirit using you. Now there's a term in the book also called reflective teaching. And this is what we want to do as teachers. Reflective teaching. Reflective teaching is where you teach a class, and then when you go home or you go away from that class, you reflect on it. You reflect on certain things that happened, certain methods of teaching, how you interacted with different students, and you want to reflect on that and think of ways that you can improve that, ways you can make that better. Because as teachers, ultimately, teachers are learners too. The students learn from the teacher, but what? The teacher also learns from the students, how to teach them. The best teacher for the teacher is the students. I say that, but also keep in mind, obviously the best teacher is God Himself. But in our situation, we want to just realize that the students are the ones that teach the teacher also. And that's done through reflective teaching, when the teacher reflects on and thinks about it, makes plans, makes changes. Now sometimes you'll implement a method in class. It may not be successful. So what? You go away from there, you give up in despair? No, you reflect on it, you think of ways to improve it, ways to make it better, and you come back and you hit it again. You go at it again, maybe use a different method. Eventually you're going to get one that's successful. So that's done through reflective teaching. And that's also, you want to implement a lot of prayer in that as well. The book doesn't mention anything about that, but prayer and reflective teaching, they can go hand in hand. Just pray and ask God to lead you in the class and just show you ways in which you can improve. Because it's usually the teachers who have the mindset that they don't need to improve. They're the ones that probably need to improve the most. God uses the ones that are lowly, that are humble, that are meek. And teachers are no exception. So what we'll do now is we'll go ahead and take a break, and then when we come back, we'll dive into Chapter 2. Chapter 2 deals with different theories of learning, whether it be psychosocial, cognitive development, and social development. Those are the three areas we're going to look at today. And so we'll deal with that as soon as we come back from break.